Welcome to Myths of the Night. Ancient stories told in whispers to guide you into calm and peaceful rest. Here, the myths of old are retold in calm voices to help you rest, reflect, and dream. On a clear night, if you look up at the northern sky, you'll find them still together after thousands of years. Perseus, the hero who defied impossible odds. Andromeda, the princess who faced death with quiet courage. Their constellations shine side by side, eternal witnesses to one of mythology's most beautiful love stories. But unlike so many tragic Greek romances that end in heartbreak and despair, theirs is a tale of triumph, of a love that conquered monsters both mortal and divine, and of a marriage that brought forth kings and heroes. The ancient Greeks looked up at those same stars and saw not just distant lights, but the very souls of lovers who had walked the earth, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy that would shape the destiny of nations. In the constellation Perseus, they saw the brave son of Zeus, forever holding the severed head of Medusa, the weapon that had saved his beloved. In Andromeda, they saw the princess stretched out as she had been when chained to the rocks, her arms outstretched, waiting for death or deliverance. And nearby, they placed Cassiopeia, Andromeda's mother, seated on her throne, sometimes upside down, as punishment for the vanity that nearly destroyed everything. This is not simply a story of a hero rescuing a damsel. It's far more complex, far more human than that. It's a story about the consequences of pride, about divine intervention and human courage, about choices made in moments of desperation, and about a love that grew from the most unlikely circumstances into something that would echo through generations. It's about two people who should never have met, bound together by fate, by the gods, and by their own fierce determination to build something beautiful in a world that seemed intent on tearing them apart. The tale of Perseus and Andromeda touches on every great theme of Greek mythology. There are prophecies that cannot be escaped, no matter how desperately one tries. There are gods who meddle in mortal affairs, sometimes out of love, sometimes out of spite, always with consequences that ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. There are monsters to be slain, both the obvious kind with serpent hair and stone-inducing gazes, and the more subtle kind that wear human faces and claim to act in the name of duty or tradition. But at its heart, this is a love story. It's the story of how Perseus, fresh from the most terrifying quest any hero had ever undertaken, stumbled upon a sight that stopped him in his tracks. a beautiful woman, chained naked to a rock, waves crashing around her, waiting to be devoured by a sea monster as punishment for her mother's foolish words. It's the story of how Andromeda, facing certain death, found herself saved by a stranger who fell in love with her on sight and was willing to fight a creature from the depths of the ocean for the chance to make her his wife. Their story begins not with their meeting, but with two separate chains of events, two prophecies, two families trying desperately to avoid fate, only to run straight into its arms. To understand how Perseus came to be flying over the coast of Ethiopia at exactly the right moment to save Andromeda, we must first go back to the beginning, to a bronze chamber in Argos where a king's daughter was locked away from the world, and to a palace in Ethiopia where a queen's vanity was about to bring disaster upon her kingdom. These two threads of destiny, seemingly unrelated, would weave together in one of mythology's most perfect moments. The hero, hardened by his quest, but still capable of wonder and love. The princess, brave in the face of death, worthy of the rescue she was about to receive. Together, they would create something rare in Greek mythology. A genuinely happy marriage, a loving partnership that would last until death and beyond. As we follow their story, we'll witness impossible quests and divine interventions, terrible monsters, and even more terrible family members, weddings interrupted by violence, and peaceful reigns that brought prosperity to entire kingdoms. We'll see how their love story became intertwined with the founding of Mycenae, one of the most powerful cities in ancient Greece, and how their descendants would include some of mythology's greatest heroes. But most importantly, we'll see two people who chose each other, who fought for each other, and who built a life together that was worth immortalizing in the stars themselves. So let's begin where all great Greek tragedies and triumphs begin, with a prophecy, a desperate father, and a plan that was doomed from the start. Perseus, the hero, born of golden rain. In the ancient city of Argos, there ruled a king named Acrisius, a man whose every decision was colored by fear. He had a daughter, Danae, beautiful beyond measure, but what he lacked was a son, an heir to carry on his name and his line. In those days, kings without sons were kings whose legacies would die with them. And Acrisius felt this lack keenly. So he did what desperate rulers throughout mythology always did. He consulted the oracle at Delphi, that priestess of Apollo, who could see the threads of fate and speak of things that were yet to come. The journey to Delphi was long, and Acrisius went with hope in his heart, expecting to hear that sons would come to him, that his line would continue strong and unbroken. But the oracle, seated in her sacred chamber, with the vapors rising around her, spoke words that turned his blood to ice. She told him that he would have no sons of his own body. That prophecy alone might have been bearable, a sad thing, but one a man could learn to live with. But the oracle was not finished. She continued, her voice echoing in that sacred space, and told him that his daughter would bear a son, and that son, his own grandson, would be the instrument of his death. Imagine receiving such news. Your only child, your beloved daughter, destined to give birth to your killer. The Greeks understood the power of prophecy, knew that once the fates had spoken, no mortal action could truly change what was to come. But understanding this did not stop people from trying. Fear, after all, is a more powerful motivator than wisdom, and Acrisius was very much afraid. He returned to Argos with his terrible knowledge, and he made a decision that would set in motion the very events he hoped to prevent. If Danae never met a man, if she never married, never loved, then surely she could never bear the son who would kill him. It was a father's logic born of terror, the kind of reasoning that feels sound in the moment, but is actually monstrous in its execution. He had a chamber built underground, or in some versions of the tale, a bronze tower sealed so completely that no mortal man could ever reach his daughter. There, he locked Danae away, with only her handmaidens for company, cutting her off from the sun, from freedom, from any hope of a normal life. Picture Danae in that bronze prison, day after day, month after month, year after year. A young woman in the prime of her life, shut away from the world because of her father's fear. The walls around her were not just bronze, but also the manifestation of Acrisius's desperate attempt to control fate. She had committed no crime, harbored no evil, yet she lived the life of a criminal, all to prevent a prophecy that her father could not accept. But the gods, as they so often did, had other plans. Zeus, the king of Olympus, the father of gods and men, looked down from his divine heights and saw Danae in her bronze prison. In some versions of the myth, he was simply struck by her beauty, that devastating loveliness that ran in her family like a curse. In others, he was moved by her plight, touched by the sight of this innocent woman suffering for a prophecy she had no part in making. Whatever his initial motivation, Zeus, who was never one to let obstacles stand in the way of his desires, decided he would have her. Now, Zeus was known for his transformations, for taking various forms to seduce or visit mortals. But in Danae's case, locked in her bronze chamber, with guards posted all around, even a god needed to be creative. So Zeus transformed himself into something that could slip through the tiniest cracks, something that could fall from the sky itself and reach Danae where no man could follow. He became a shower of golden rain, luminous and divine, and he poured into her chamber like sunlight made liquid, like the touch of heaven itself falling upon the earth. Can you imagine it? After years in the darkness, suddenly there is light, golden and warm, surrounding you, touching you, filling your prison with radiance. For Danae, it must have seemed like a dream, like the end of her long loneliness. The sources don't tell us if she knew immediately that this was Zeus, if she recognized the divine presence in that moment, or if understanding came later. What we do know is that from that union, from that impossible meeting of God and mortal woman, a child was conceived. That child would be Perseus, and he would indeed be unlike any ordinary mortal, carrying within him the blood of the king of the gods. Pregnancy cannot be hidden forever, and when Acrisius discovered that his imprisoned daughter was with child, his worst fears seemed to be coming true. He raged at her, demanded to know how this could have happened, how any man could have reached her in her sealed chamber. When Danae told him the truth, that Zeus himself had come to her as golden rain, Acrisius laughed bitterly. It was an old story, he thought, a tale as ancient as time itself. A young woman found pregnant, claiming divine intervention to explain the unexplainable. He didn't believe her. How could he? It was easier to believe that she lied, that somehow guards had been bribed or walls had been breached, than to accept that the gods themselves had intervened to bring about his prophesied doom. When Perseus was born, Acrisius found himself in a terrible position. He held his grandson, the child prophesied to kill him, and he had to decide what to do. To kill a child, especially one's own blood, would bring down the fury of the gods. But to let him live was to live with the constant fear that any day might bring the fulfillment of the prophecy. Acrisius chose what he thought was a middle path, a solution that would technically spare the child's life while still removing the threat. He had a large wooden chest, constructed, sturdy, but crude, and into this chest he placed Danae and the infant Perseus. Then he had them taken to the sea and cast into the waves. It was a death sentence that technically wasn't murder, and Acrisius could tell himself that he had given them to the gods, that their fate was no longer in his hands. If they drowned, well, that was the sea's doing, not his. If they lived, then perhaps the gods truly did favor them. It was coward's logic, the desperate rationalization of a man who wanted both to defy prophecy and to avoid responsibility for his actions. But Danae and Perseus did not drown. Whether it was Zeus protecting his son and the woman he had loved, or Poseidon calming the waves at Zeus's request, the chest did not sink. Instead, it bobbed on the surface of the water, carried by currents that seemed almost deliberately gentle. For days they drifted, Danae holding her infant son, singing to him perhaps, praying certainly, wondering if they would die slowly of thirst and exposure, or if the chest would simply fill with water and drag them down into the depths. The chest washed up on the shores of Seriphos, a small island in the Aegean Sea. There, a fisherman named Dictys, casting his nets in the early morning light, saw the strange sight of a wooden chest being pushed onto the beach by the waves. When he opened it, expecting perhaps cargo from a wrecked ship or some strange prize from the sea, he found instead a beautiful woman and her baby, both somehow still alive after their ordeal. Dictys was a good man, humble and kind, the sort of person mythology often presents as the contrast to corrupt kings and scheming nobility. He took Danae and Perseus into his home without hesitation, asked no payment, sought no reward. He simply saw people in need and helped them, as simple and as extraordinary as that. He raised Perseus as if the boy were his own son, taught him the skills of a fisherman, gave him a home and a sense of belonging. Under Dictys's care, Perseus grew from infant to boy to young man, strong and clever and brave, though he knew nothing yet of his divine heritage or the prophecy that hung over his family like a shadow. But peace in Greek mythology is always temporary. Dictys had a brother, Polydectes, who was the king of Seriphos. And as Perseus grew toward manhood, Polydectes grew increasingly obsessed with Danae. She was still beautiful, even after years of exile, years of hardship, and the king wanted her for his wife. But Danae refused him, and one of the reasons she could refuse was Perseus. Her son, now grown strong and protective, made it clear that his mother would not be forced into any marriage she did not desire. Polydectes was not a man who handled rejection well. He was the type of ruler who viewed his power as absolute, who could not stand the idea of a woman, even a nobly born one, refusing his advances. But he was also cunning enough to realize that he couldn't simply have Perseus killed. Not without consequences, Not when everyone on the island knew that the young man had done nothing wrong except protect his mother. So Polydectes devised a plan that he thought was clever, a scheme that would get Perseus out of the way while making it seem as if it were all the young man's own doing. Polydectes announced that he was to marry another woman, not Danae after all, and he invited all the men of the island to bring him wedding gifts. This was customary, a way for subjects to honor their king and for the king to display his wealth and power. Each man was expected to bring a horse, a valuable gift, but one that most could afford with some difficulty. Perseus, raised by a humble fisherman, had no horse and no means to acquire one. He felt the sting of this, the shame of having nothing to offer, when all around him men were bringing their gifts to the king. Polydectes, seeing his distress, smiled and made an offer that seemed generous, but was actually venomous. He told Perseus that if he had no horse, he could bring something else instead, anything at all. Whatever Perseus thought would be a worthy gift. And Perseus, young and proud and foolish, trapped by the king's false generosity and his own desire not to be shamed, boasted that he could bring Polydectes anything, even the head of Medusa herself. The crowd must have fallen silent at those words. Everyone knew about Medusa, about the Gorgon, whose gaze turned living flesh to stone, whose head was wreathed with living serpents, who was guarded by her two immortal sisters. Men who went seeking Medusa did not return. Their stone forms surrounded her lair, eternal monuments to their failure and their final moments of terror. For Perseus to promise such a thing was essentially to announce his own death. But Polydectes accepted the offer with false concern, as if he were reluctant to hold Perseus to such a dangerous promise, as if he weren't delighted at the prospect of this troublesome young man going off to certain death. Perseus, trapped by his own words and his own pride, had no choice but to attempt what he had promised. He had to seek out Medusa, the monster that had killed countless heroes before him, and somehow, impossibly, take her head and return with it alive. It seemed like suicide. Polydectes was certain it was, but neither of them knew that Perseus was not quite mortal, that divine blood ran in his veins, and that the gods themselves were watching. The quest for Medusa's head. Perseus set out on his quest with the grim determination of a man who knows he is walking toward his own death but cannot turn back. For days he wandered, searching in vain for any information about where Medusa might be found. The location of the Gorgon's lair was known to no mortal, and those who might have known were either dead or had been turned to stone, frozen forever in their final moments of terror, unable to share what they had discovered. But Perseus was not truly mortal, though he did not fully understand that yet. He was the son of Zeus, and the gods were watching his struggle with interest. Finally, when he was at his lowest point, when he had begun to believe that he would wander until he died of exposure or starvation, never even finding what he sought, help arrived in the form of two divine visitors who appeared before him, as if materializing out of the air itself. The first was a tall woman of terrible beauty, her gray eyes sharp and assessing. She wore armor that seemed to glow with its own light, and she carried a spear that looked as if it could pierce the very heavens. This was Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, the deity who understood both the strategy of battle and the cunning needed to survive impossible odds. The second was a young man with an easy smile, wearing winged sandals that let him hover just above the ground. This was Hermes, the messenger of the gods, the divine trickster, the one who moved between all worlds with equal ease. They introduced themselves to Perseus, and they explained something that must have seemed incredible. They were his half-siblings, children of Zeus, just as he was, and they had come to help him in his quest. But their help came with a reason. Medusa, they explained, was not simply a monster to be slain for sport or to fulfill a boastful promise. She had once been a beautiful woman, a priestess in Athena's own temple, who had been violated by Poseidon. When this sacrilege occurred, when Poseidon defiled Athena's sacred space, the goddess had not punished him. Instead, as was so often the case in Greek mythology, she had punished the victim, transforming the beautiful Medusa into a creature so hideous that merely looking at her face would turn any living thing to stone. Now, Medusa was one of 3 Gorgons, but she was the only mortal one. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, were immortal and could not be killed. But Medusa, despite her terrible power, could die. And Athena, perhaps feeling some distant pang of conscience, perhaps simply recognizing that Medusa's existence had become a problem that needed solving, had decided that Perseus would be the one to end her. But they would not send him defenseless. Athena reached into the air and pulled forth a shield, not just any shield, but one polished to a mirror shine, so bright and clear that you could see every detail of the world reflected in its surface. She explained that he must never look directly at Medusa, never let his eyes meet hers, or he would become stone like all the others. Instead, he would have to approach her while looking only at her reflection in this shield, using the mirror to guide him. Hermes had gifts of his own. First, he gave Perseus his own winged sandals, those magical talaria that allowed the messenger god to fly between Earth and Olympus, between the world of mortals and the realm of the dead. With these on his feet, Perseus would be able to soar through the air, to reach places no mortal could otherwise go, to escape dangers that would trap an ordinary man. Second, he produced a sword, but not just any blade. This was an adamantine sickle, a curved weapon made from the same imperishable metal that Kronos had used to castrate his father Uranus in the ancient days. Its edge would never dull, and it could cut through anything, even the enchanted flesh of a gorgon. But even with these divine gifts, Perseus still lacked crucial information. He knew he had to kill Medusa, and he had the tools to do it, but he still didn't know where to find her. For this, Athena and Hermes directed him to seek out the Graeae, the Grey Sisters. These were 3 ancient women, sisters to the Gorgons themselves, who shared between them a single eye and a single tooth. They alone knew the location of their Gorgon sisters, and they alone could tell Perseus where to find what he sought. The journey to find the Graeae took Perseus to the edge of the world, to a desolate place where the mist lay thick and the light seemed dim even at midday. There, in a cave, he found them, 3 gray-haired women, ancient beyond reckoning, passing their single eye back and forth between them so that each could take a turn seeing. They passed their single tooth the same way, taking turns with the ability to eat. It was a grotesque existence, but they had lived this way for so long that they knew nothing else. Perseus watched them for a time, studying their routine, and he formed a plan. He waited until the moment when one sister had removed the eye to pass it to another, when it was held in a grasping hand, but not yet in any socket, suspended between them. In that instant, Perseus darted forward and snatched the eye from their fumbling fingers. Suddenly, all 3 sisters were blind, groping in the darkness, crying out in confusion and rage. He told them who he was and what he wanted, the location of the Gorgon's lair, and after that, directions to find the nymphs of the north, the Hesperides, who guarded certain other items he would need. The Graeae resisted at first, hurling curses and threats, but Perseus held firm. He would return their eye, he said, but only after they told him what he needed to know. Eventually, knowing they had no choice, the Grey Sisters gave him the information he sought. From the Hesperides, Perseus obtained the final items he needed for his quest. These nymphs, guardians of treasures at the world's edge, gave him a special bag, a kibisis, a magical satchel that could safely contain Medusa's head once he severed it. They also gave him the helm of darkness, associated with Hades, which would make Perseus completely invisible when worn, hidden from sight and sound. Finally, Perseus had everything he needed: divine weapons, divine protection, divine knowledge. He flew on Hermes' winged sandals to the lair of the Gorgons, to the edge of the world, where night seemed to linger even in daylight, where the very air felt thick with ancient malevolence. As he approached, he saw them, the stone statues of countless warriors who had come before him, each frozen in their final moment, faces twisted in expressions of horror and disbelief. Some had weapons raised as if to strike, but their blows had never fallen. Some had turned to run, but their legs would never carry them another step. All were stone now, eternal monuments to Medusa's power. Perseus put on the helm of darkness and felt himself vanish from the world, felt the cool touch of invisibility settle over him like a cloak. Moving silently, carefully, he made his way past the petrified warriors, past the entrance to the cave where the Gorgons slept. And they were sleeping, all three of them, their terrible bodies at rest. They had wings of gold and bronze scales, claws that could tear through armor. And those faces, those terrible faces. Stheno and Euryale were immortal and untouchable. But Medusa, she was the mortal one, and Perseus had to be sure to strike the right target. He moved closer, watching not the Gorgons themselves, but only their reflections in Athena's polished shield. He could see Medusa clearly in the mirror surface, could see the serpents that crowned her head writhing even in sleep. Some accounts suggest he felt pity, remembering what Athena had told him, that this creature had once been a woman transformed as punishment. But pity could not stay his hand. And regardless of how she came to be this way, as long as Medusa lived, she would continue to kill those who looked upon her. He raised the adamantine sickle, guided by the reflection, watching as he positioned himself perfectly. Then, with one swift movement, with all the strength he possessed, he brought the blade down. The enchanted metal sliced through Medusa's neck as if it were butter, and her head separated from her body. In that instant, something miraculous and terrible happened. From Medusa's severed neck, from the blood that spurted forth, two beings emerged, born from her even in death. First came Chrysaor, a giant warrior already fully formed, wielding a golden sword. Second came Pegasus, the winged horse, pure white and magnificent. These were the children she had conceived with Poseidon before her transformation, the offspring that had been trapped within her monstrous form until Perseus's blade set them free. But Perseus had no time to marvel at this wonder. Even as Medusa's head was severed, her immortal sisters began to wake, alerted by some change in the air, by some disturbance they could sense, but not yet identify. Perseus grabbed Medusa's head by her serpent hair, being careful not to look at her face, and thrust it into the magical Cetus. Then he turned and ran, or rather flew, the winged sandals carrying him up and away, as Stheno and Uriel burst forth from the cave, shrieking their rage, searching for the killer they could not see. The helm of darkness saved him. Though the Gorgon sisters flew after him with terrible speed, though they searched the skies with eyes that could see for miles, Perseus remained invisible. Eventually, they lost his trail, and he was able to fly away, carrying his terrible prize, the head that could still turn living flesh to stone, even severed from its body. Perseus began the long journey home to Seriphos, his quest complete, carrying the proof that would fulfill his boast and free his mother from Polydectes' harassment. But fate had other plans, and his journey would be interrupted by a sight that would change his life forever. As he flew over the coast of a distant land called Ethiopia, he looked down and saw something that made him stop mid-flight, hovering in the air with his winged sandals, staring in disbelief at what lay below. A beautiful woman, naked, chained to a rock by the sea, waves crashing around her, waiting to be devoured by something he couldn't yet see, but could sense in the deep water beyond the breakers. He had found Andromeda, though he didn't know her name yet, didn't know her story. He only knew that he had to save her. Cassiopeia's vanity and divine punishment. To understand how Andromeda came to be chained to that rock, we must turn our attention to her mother, Queen Cassiopeia of Ethiopia, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her pride, and whose pride would bring catastrophe upon her entire kingdom. Cassiopeia was married to King Cepheus, a decent and reasonable man who ruled his kingdom fairly, and together they had one child, a daughter named Andromeda, who inherited her mother's extraordinary beauty, but thankfully had not yet developed her mother's dangerous vanity. Ethiopia, in the ancient Greek understanding, was not the modern nation we know today, but rather a mythological kingdom somewhere along the Mediterranean coast, possibly along the shores of what is now Israel or Lebanon, or perhaps along the coast of North Africa. It was a prosperous place, blessed with good harbors and fertile lands. And Cassiopeia should have been content with her position as queen, with her loving husband and beautiful daughter, with the peace and prosperity her kingdom enjoyed. Cassiopeia's boasting went beyond mere maternal pride. She began to claim that she and her daughter were more beautiful than the Nereids themselves, those 50 daughters of the sea god Nereus, who were renowned throughout the world for their loveliness. Some versions of the myth say Cassiopeia claimed this beauty for herself, while others say she claimed it for Andromeda, but the result was the same. Think about what this meant in the context of Greek religious belief. The Nereids were not mortal women who could be compared to other mortals without offense. They were divine beings, attendants to the gods, semi-divine entities who dwelt in the depths of the ocean and served Poseidon himself. To claim that a mortal woman, even one as beautiful as Andromeda, surpassed them in beauty was not just arrogant. It was blasphemous. It was hubris, that particular Greek concept of excessive pride that brings down divine punishment upon those foolish enough to display it. And Cassiopeia didn't just make this claim once, in a moment of thoughtless pride. She boasted about it constantly, loudly, to anyone who would listen. She had poems composed comparing Andromeda to the Nereids. She commissioned art that depicted her daughter as superior to these divine beings. She essentially built her daughter's reputation and her own on the direct insult of divine creatures who had the power to destroy them all. The Nereids heard these boasts, of course. In Greek mythology, the gods and their attendants always seemed to hear when mortals spoke ill of them, or claimed to be their equals or betters. The Nereids were hurt and insulted. They had done nothing to Cassiopeia or her family. They had never claimed to be rivals to Andromeda. But now this mortal queen was using their names as stepping stones to elevate her daughter's reputation, implying that divine beauty was less than mortal beauty, that the sea nymphs were somehow inferior. So the Nereids did what any affronted beings with divine connections would do. They went to Poseidon, the god of the seas, the earth shaker, the one who could calm waves or raise storms with a thought. They pleaded their case before him, told him of Cassiopeia's constant insults, and demanded that he punish this mortal queen for her arrogance. Some versions of the myth say that the Nereids were especially insulted because two of their number were particularly important to Poseidon. His wife, Amphitrite, was herself a Nereid, as was Cetus, the mother of Achilles. To insult the Nereids was to insult Poseidon's own wife, and that was something the god could not ignore, even if he had wanted to. Poseidon's rage was terrible to behold. he was not a god known for his mercy or his restraint. When angered, he would shake the earth, tear open the ocean floor, drown coastal cities for offenses real or imagined. And Cassiopeia's offense was very real. She had insulted his Nereids, had essentially claimed that divine beauty meant nothing compared to mortal beauty. And worse, she showed no sign of stopping her boasts or acknowledging that she had overstepped. So Poseidon unleashed his punishment upon Ethiopia. First came the floods. The sea rose higher than it ever had before, sweeping inland, destroying homes and fields, drowning livestock, and people who could not escape in time. The carefully cultivated farmlands that had made Ethiopia prosperous were turned into salt marshes. The harbors that had brought trade and wealth were overwhelmed by massive waves. The kingdom that had been peaceful and prosperous was suddenly fighting for survival against the wrath of the sea itself. But Poseidon was not finished. The floods were only the beginning, the softening blow before the real punishment arrived. From the depths of the ocean, he sent forth Cetus, a massive sea monster, a creature of nightmare proportions. In some tellings, Cetus was whale-like, enormous beyond measure, with jaws that could swallow ships whole. In others, it was more serpentine, a dragon from the depths with scales that turned aside weapons and claws that could tear through stone. Whatever its exact form, Cetus was unstoppable, and it began to ravage the coast of Ethiopia, devouring anyone unfortunate enough to be near the shore, destroying what little the floods had not already claimed. The people of Ethiopia suffered terribly, and they knew why. Word of Cassiopeia's boasts had spread throughout the kingdom. Everyone knew that their queen's pride had brought this catastrophe upon them. Delegations came to the palace, begging Cepheus to do something, to find some way to appease the gods, to end the suffering of his people. Some probably demanded that Cassiopeia herself be punished, be exiled, or worse. But Cepheus loved his wife despite her flaws, and he sought another way. He traveled to consult an oracle, seeking guidance on how to end the divine punishment. In most accounts, this was the oracle of Ammon, a prophet who could speak the will of the gods. The journey was dangerous, through lands devastated by flood and haunted by the fear of Cetus's next appearance. But Cepheus was a king, and his people were suffering. He had to try something, anything, to end the catastrophe that had befallen his kingdom. The oracle's message was clear and terrible. there was only one way to appease Poseidon's wrath, only one sacrifice that would satisfy the gods' anger and save the kingdom. Andromeda, the innocent daughter whose beauty had been the subject of her mother's blasphemous boasts, had to be offered to Cetus. She was to be chained to the rocks by the sea, left there as a sacrifice to the monster. Only when Cetus had devoured her would Poseidon's anger be satisfied, and only then would the kingdom be allowed to recover. Imagine receiving such news. Your daughter, your only child, must die horribly to save your kingdom. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because her mother had been foolish and vain. Cepheus returned to his palace with a heavy heart, carrying news that would destroy his family, even as it saved his people. He told Cassiopeia what the oracle had said, and for perhaps the first time in her life, the queen fell silent, confronted with the true cost of her pride. They could have refused, of course. They could have said no, kept Andromeda safe within the palace walls, and let the kingdom suffer the consequences. But Cepheus was a king, and he understood that a ruler's duty is to his people, even when that duty demands the unthinkable. And perhaps, deep down, Cassiopeia knew that this was her fault, that her words had brought this doom upon her daughter, and that there was no escape from the consequences of what she had done. The people demanded it too. They had suffered so much already. They had watched their homes destroyed, their loved ones drowned, their livelihoods torn apart by flood and monster. They knew that Andromeda was innocent, and many must have wept at what was being asked. But they also knew that entire families, entire villages had already been lost to Poseidon's wrath, and more would die if something wasn't done. One life, even an innocent life, even a princess, seemed like a bearable cost compared to the potential destruction of the entire kingdom. So the decision was made. On a day that must have dawned bright and beautiful, mocking the darkness of what was to come, Andromeda was led down to the shore. She was to be chained naked to the rocks, exposed and vulnerable, left for Cetus to find and devour. The nakedness was part of the sacrifice, a sign of complete vulnerability, of absolute offering. She could not be armed, could not be protected by armor or clothing. She had to be given to the monster exactly as she was, with nothing between her and death. Try to imagine what she must have felt in those moments. Andromeda knew why this was happening. She knew that her mother's words had brought Poseidon's wrath upon the kingdom. She knew that she had done nothing wrong herself, had never claimed to be more beautiful than the Nereids. had never wanted the comparisons or the boasts. Yet here she was, paying the price for someone else's pride. Some versions of the myth say she went willingly, accepting her fate with courage and dignity, understanding that her death might save thousands of lives. Other versions hint that she was terrified, but brave, that she wept, but did not resist, knowing that resistance was pointless. The chains that bound her to the rocks were heavy and cold. They secured her arms outstretched, leaving her completely exposed to the elements and to the gaze of anyone who might see. The rocks were chosen carefully, positioned so that when the tide came in, she would be partially submerged, the water rising around her, making her even more accessible to the sea monster that dwelt in the depths below. The placement was calculated to attract Cetus, to make the sacrifice obvious and acceptable to the creature and the god who commanded it. Her parents stood on the shore, watching, unable to bear looking, but unable to look away. Cassiopeia, who had always been so proud of her daughter's beauty, now saw that beauty become the instrument of death. Cepheus, torn between his love for his daughter and his duty to his kingdom, could do nothing but watch and pray that the gods would somehow show mercy, though he knew better than to expect it. The people of the kingdom watched too, from the shore and from the cliffs, witnessing the sacrifice that would purchase their salvation. Andromeda waited, chained to the rock, as the sun moved across the sky. The waves crashed around her, cold and relentless. The salt spray stung her eyes. Seabirds circled overhead, their cries sounding almost like mockery. She waited for death to come from the depths, for Cetus to emerge and end her life in terror and agony. She waited, and she must have prayed, though whether she prayed for rescue or simply for a quick death, we cannot know. The hours stretched on. The tide rose, the water climbing higher around her, and still Cetus did not come. Perhaps the monster was taking its time, savoring the fear that radiated from the shore, feeding on the anticipation of the meal that awaited it. Perhaps Poseidon himself was watching, wanting to draw out the moment, to ensure that the lesson of Cassiopeia's hubris was thoroughly learned by all who witnessed it. But the gods had not accounted for Perseus. They had not known that at that very moment, a young hero, fresh from killing Medusa, was flying overhead with winged sandals, carrying in his magical bag a weapon that could turn living flesh to stone with a single glance. They had not known that Perseus, looking down, would see Andromeda chained to those rocks, and would be struck not just by her beauty, though she was indeed beautiful, but by the terrible injustice of the scene before him. An innocent woman, sacrificed for sins not her own, waiting to be devoured by a monster while her kingdom watched. Perseus descended from the sky, and Andromeda's story, which had seemed destined to end in tragedy, was about to take a very different turn. The fateful encounter. Love at first sight. Perseus landed on the rocks near Andromeda, his winged sandals carrying him down from the sky in a sight that must have seemed like a dream or a divine vision. Here was a young man appearing from nowhere, seemingly able to fly, armed and confident, approaching her when everyone else had abandoned her to her fate. She must have thought he was a god at first, or perhaps a hallucination born of fear and desperation, because mortal men did not fly, and no one in their right mind would willingly approach someone who was bait for a sea monster. But Perseus was very much mortal, or at least partly so, and he was very much real. He came close enough to speak to her, careful to maintain some respectful distance despite her nakedness. And he asked her a question that must have seemed absurd under the circumstances. He asked her why she was chained to these rocks, as if she had chosen this, as if there could be any reason other than the obvious one, that she was a sacrifice waiting to be claimed. Andromeda, according to Ovid's later telling of this tale, was initially too modest and ashamed to answer. Here she was, naked and chained, confronted by a strange but handsome young man who had appeared from the sky. In any other circumstance, her modesty would have demanded she hide herself, but she couldn't. The chains held her exposed, vulnerable, and all she could do was turn her face away, trying to preserve some shred of dignity in this utterly undignified situation. If her hands had been free, Ovid tells us, she would have covered her face in shame. But Perseus was gentle in his questioning, and something about his manner, his obvious concern, his lack of any lecherousness despite her vulnerability, made her feel safe enough to answer. Tears began to fall as she told him her story. She explained about her mother's boasts, about Poseidon's anger, about the oracle's decree. She told him that she was innocent of any wrongdoing, that she had never claimed to be more beautiful than the Nereids, never wanted the comparisons that had brought divine wrath upon her kingdom. She was here because her mother had been vain and her father had been desperate, and now she would die because the gods demanded blood for an insult she had never given. Perseus listened to all of this, and something happened in that moment that myths and legends have tried to capture for thousands of years, but that remains fundamentally mysterious. He fell in love, not the slow, growing affection that develops between people who know each other well, but the immediate, overwhelming, irrational love that strikes like lightning and changes everything in an instant. The Greeks had a word for it, though it's more commonly associated with passionate desire than with what we might call true love. But whatever we call it, Perseus looked at Andromeda, heard her story, saw her courage in the face of unjust death, and decided that she was worth fighting for. He made a decision that would change both their lives. He told her that he would save her, that he would kill the monster Cetus and free her from her chains. But he was also practical, in the way that heroes in myths sometimes surprisingly are. He told her that if he did this, if he saved her life and her kingdom, he wanted something in return. He wanted her hand in marriage. He wanted her to be his wife. It might seem mercenary, negotiating marriage terms while a woman is chained to a rock, waiting to be devoured by a sea monster. It might seem like he was taking advantage of her desperate situation, making demands when she had no power to refuse. But consider the context. Perseus was offering to risk his life for her, to face a monster that had already killed countless people. And he was doing it not out of obligation or duty, but out of love. He was also giving her a choice, offering a bargain rather than simply demanding gratitude. Save your life in exchange for marriage. It was transactional, yes, but in a world where marriages were typically arranged by parents for political or economic advantage, it was also surprisingly romantic. He was saying, in effect, that he valued her enough to fight for her, and that if he survived, he wanted to spend his life with her. But Perseus wasn't just negotiating with Andromeda. He couldn't be. She was a princess. And in that culture, in that time, daughters did not make their own marriage arrangements, especially not while chained to rocks awaiting death. So Perseus flew to the shore where Cepheus and Cassiopeia stood watching their daughter's final hours. He landed before them, this strange young man with his winged sandals and his confident bearing, and he made them an offer they could hardly believe. He would save Andromeda, he told them. He would kill Cetus and free their daughter from her chains, and in return, they would give her to him in marriage. He would take her away with him when he left, back to his home in Seriphos, and she would be his wife. It was a bold proposal. Some might say an arrogant one, this stranger appearing from nowhere and demanding their daughter's hand. But what choice did they have? their daughter was chained to a rock, waiting to die, and this young man was offering to save her. Even if they had doubts about him, even if Cassiopeia's pride bristled at the idea of giving her daughter to some unknown wanderer, the alternative was watching Andromeda be devoured by a monster. Cepheus, described in most sources as a reasonable and caring father, agreed immediately. More than that, he sweetened the deal. He promised Perseus not just Andromeda's hand, but also a kingdom. If Perseus saved his daughter, Cepheus would make him heir to the throne of Ethiopia. Perseus would become a king, would rule over this land he had just discovered, would have wealth and power beyond what a fisherman's adopted son could ever dream of achieving. It was a generous offer, perhaps suspiciously generous, but Cepheus was desperate, and he understood that you had to offer something extraordinary to convince someone to willingly fight a monster that had killed so many before. Perseus accepted the terms. He flew back to Andromeda and told her what had been arranged. She, still chained to the rocks, could only wait and hope that this stranger who had promised to save her could actually do what he claimed. After all, many men had probably been brave before they faced Cetus. The scattered bones along the coast testified to how those encounters typically ended. And then the sea began to churn. From the depths, Cetus was rising, drawn by the scent of the sacrifice, by the presence of the vulnerable woman chained to the rocks. The water roiled and darkened, and then the monster emerged. Different sources describe Cetus in different ways, but all agree on the essential details. It was massive, larger than any natural creature, with jaws that could swallow a human being whole. Its body, whether scaled like a dragon or smooth like a whale, was armored against weapons, protected by skin that had turned aside every attack that had been launched against it. Its eyes were filled with a kind of ancient hunger, a mindless drive to devour and destroy. The people on the shore cried out in terror as Cetus appeared, and Andromeda, chained and helpless, could only watch as death approached. But Perseus did not flee. He took to the air with his winged sandals, flying up and away from the rocks, drawing the monster's attention. Cetus, seeing this new moving target, this human who dared to fly like a bird, turned from Andromeda and focused on Perseus instead. Perhaps it thought him easier prey, or perhaps it was simply following its instinct to chase anything that moved. Either way, Perseus had accomplished his first goal. He had drawn the monster away from the woman he intended to save. What followed was a battle unlike anything the Watchers had ever seen. Perseus flew through the air, dodging and weaving as Cetus lunged and snapped at him with jaws that could crush stone. The monster's size made it powerful, but also made it slower compared to Perseus's supernatural agility with his winged sandals. He could dart in close, strike with his adamantine sword, and fly away again before the monster could retaliate. The enchanted blade cut through Cetus's armored hide with each strike, drawing blood that turned the waters dark. The battle was long and desperate. Different versions of the myth describe the conclusion differently. In some tellings, Perseus wore down the monster through repeated strikes with his divine sword, finally finding a vulnerable spot, perhaps the creature's throat or eye, and delivering a fatal blow. In other versions, Perseus resorted to his ultimate weapon. He reached into the kybesis and pulled forth Medusa's severed head. Even dead, her power remained intact. Perseus held the head toward Cetus, forcing the monster to gaze upon it, and the creature's flesh turned to stone. The mighty sea monster became a statue and sank beneath the waves, returning to the depths as lifeless rock. Perseus flew to the rocks and used his sword to break the chains that held Andromeda. She collapsed into his arms, weak from exposure, from fear, from the overwhelming relief of survival when she had been certain she would die. He wrapped her in his cloak, covering her nakedness, and he carried her to shore where her parents waited. The people of Ethiopia, who had watched the battle from the safety of the cliffs and the shore, erupted in celebration. Their kingdom was saved. Their princess was alive, and a hero had appeared seemingly from the gods themselves to deliver them from catastrophe. Cepheus and Cassiopeia embraced their daughter, weeping with joy and relief. Cassiopeia, for once in her life, was silent about beauty and comparisons. She had come too close to losing everything because of her pride. And even she could recognize that this was a moment for gratitude, not boasting. Cepheus kept his word immediately. He declared that Perseus would marry Andromeda, and that a great wedding feast would be prepared to celebrate not just the marriage, but also the salvation of the kingdom. Perseus looked at Andromeda, and she looked back at him. And in that moment, the bargain that had been struck became something more than a transaction. She had seen him risk his life for her, had watched him battle a monster driven by his promise to save her. He had seen her face death with courage, had heard her story, and recognized the injustice of her situation. What had begun as an arrangement made under desperate circumstances was already transforming into something that looked very much like genuine connection. They had known each other for only hours, But those hours had contained enough drama, enough danger, enough raw emotion to forge a bond that might take others years to develop. The wedding was arranged quickly, perhaps because Cepheus wanted to ensure that Perseus couldn't change his mind, perhaps because everyone wanted something joyful and celebratory after the darkness of the recent months. A great feast was prepared in the palace, and guests were invited from across the kingdom and beyond. It would be a celebration worthy of a princess and the hero who had saved her. A moment of happiness after so much fear and suffering. But as Perseus and Andromeda prepared for their wedding, neither of them knew that one person in particular was not happy about these arrangements. Someone who thought he had a prior claim to Andromeda. Someone who had been notably absent during her time of need, but who now returned just in time to object to her marriage to another man. His name was Phineus, and he was about to turn what should have been a joyous celebration into a bloodbath. The wedding interrupted. Phineus's betrayal. Phineus was Cepheus's brother, which made him Andromeda's uncle, though he was young enough that he had been betrothed to her, rather than regarded as a father figure. In the ancient world, marriages between uncles and nieces were not unheard of, especially among royalty, where keeping power and bloodlines within the family was often considered more important than modern notions of appropriate relationships. Phineus had been promised Andromeda's hand before any of the recent catastrophes had occurred, back when Cassiopeia's boasting had seemed like nothing more than a mother's pride, and when the kingdom's biggest concern had been prosperity rather than survival. But when Poseidon's wrath had descended upon Ethiopia, when the floods came and Cetus began its reign of terror, when it became clear that Andromeda would have to be sacrificed to save the kingdom, Phineus had done nothing. He had not objected to the sacrifice. He had not offered to fight Cetus himself. He had not stood by his betrothed in her darkest hour. Instead, according to the sources, he had quietly accepted that Andromeda would die, perhaps even been relieved that his marriage plans had been cancelled in a way that no one could blame him for. After all, if your bride-to-be is killed by a sea monster as a sacrifice to appease an angry god, no one can accuse you of being a coward for not marrying her. But now Andromeda was alive, saved by a stranger who had appeared from nowhere and done what Phineus had not been willing to do. And not only was she alive, but she was being married to this stranger, this Perseus, and Cepheus was offering him the throne, the very throne that Phineus, as the king's brother, might have hoped to inherit himself someday. Suddenly, Phineus's convenient acceptance of Andromeda's sacrifice looked like cowardice, and his failure to act looked like a mark against his honor and his prospects. So Phineus decided to object to the wedding, but not in any civilized way, not through negotiation or legal challenge. Instead, he gathered a group of armed men, supporters who were loyal to him or who had their own grievances against Cepheus, or who were simply the kind of men who enjoyed violence and saw an opportunity for it. Then he burst into the wedding feast with his armed followers, disrupting the celebration and demanding that Andromeda be given to him, claiming his prior right as her original betrothed. Imagine the scene. The great hall of the palace decorated for celebration, tables laden with food and wine, guests dressed in their finest clothing, musicians playing. And at the center of it all, Perseus and Andromeda, newly married or about to be married, depending on exactly when Phineus made his entrance. Then, suddenly, the doors crash open, and armed men pour in, led by Phineus with a weapon in his hand and rage on his face. The music stops, the guests cry out in alarm, and what should have been a joyous occasion transforms into something that looks more like a battle than a wedding. Perseus stood and faced Phineus, and according to Ovid's detailed account of this incident, he tried to reason with the intruder. He pointed out that Phineus had abandoned Andromeda when she needed him most. Where was he, Perseus asked, when she was chained to the rocks? Where was his courage when Cetus threatened to devour her? Phineus had done nothing to save her, had made no attempt to fight for her, and therefore he had forfeited any right to claim her now. Andromeda was Perseus's wife by right of rescue, by the agreement he had made with Cepheus, and by her own consent, which she had given freely once she was no longer chained and desperate. But Phineus wasn't interested in logic or honor. He was interested in what he believed was rightfully his, and he accused Cepheus of breaking a sacred betrothal agreement. The fact that he had been willing to let that agreement die along with Andromeda apparently didn't matter to him. He saw Perseus as a stranger, an interloper who had taken advantage of the kingdom's disaster to steal a bride and a throne that should have belonged to someone with an actual blood connection to the royal family. Cepheus himself spoke up, defending his decision. He pointed out that the betrothal to Phineus had been voided the moment Andromeda was sentenced to be sacrificed. You couldn't be engaged to a dead woman, and everyone, including Phineus, had accepted that Andromeda would die. Perseus had saved her when no one else would, and by the terms of their agreement, she was his. Moreover, Cepheus was the king, and he had the right to decide who his daughter would marry. He had chosen Perseus, and that should have been the end of the discussion. But discussions were over. Phineus had not come to negotiate. He had come to take what he wanted by force, and when words failed to sway anyone, he gave a signal to his armed followers. The attack began. In the great hall, during what should have been a wedding feast, swords were drawn and violence erupted. Guests screamed and tried to flee or hide. Some of Phineus's men went after Perseus directly, while others seemed more interested in causing general chaos, perhaps hoping to create enough confusion that they could grab Andromeda and escape with her. Perseus found himself fighting for his life and for his bride in the middle of his own wedding celebration. He had his sword, the same adamantine blade that had killed Medusa and wounded Cetus, and he used it to defend himself against the first attackers. But Phineus had brought many men, and they kept coming. Perseus cut down those who attacked him directly, but the odds were not in his favor. He was one man, admittedly a skilled warrior and a son of Zeus, but still just one person against dozens of armed attackers. The battle raged through the hall. Blood stained the floors where moments before guests had been dancing. Tables were overturned, wedding decorations were trampled, and the celebration became a nightmare. Andromeda's parents tried to protect their daughter, and some of the wedding guests, particularly those who were warriors themselves, took up arms to defend their hosts and fight off the attackers. But Phineus's force was substantial, and the defenders were being overwhelmed. Perseus made a decision. He had tried to avoid using his ultimate weapon, his trump card that had already proven effective against Cetus. Medusa's head was a tool of last resort, something to be used only when all other options had failed, because its power was so absolute and so terrible. But he was running out of options, surrounded by enemies, fighting to protect not just himself, but also Andromeda and everyone else in the hall who had done nothing wrong except attend a wedding. He shouted a warning to his friends and to those loyal to Cepheus. He told them to close their eyes, to look away, to not watch what he was about to do. Some heeded his warning immediately, understanding from his tone that something terrible was coming. Others were too caught up in the battle, too focused on their immediate threats, to pay attention to his words. And Phineus's men, of course, ignored him entirely, thinking, perhaps, that he was bluffing, or that whatever he planned couldn't possibly stop all of them. Perseus reached into the cabysus and pulled forth Medusa's head. Even covered, even contained, It radiated power, a kind of terrible presence that made the air feel heavy and cold. He held it high, turning it toward Phineus and his attackers, and he looked away himself, careful never to let his own gaze fall upon that deadly face. Then he pulled away the covering, exposing Medusa's visage to everyone in the hall who hadn't heeded his warning. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. Men who had been mid-swing with their weapons suddenly froze, their bodies transforming from living flesh to solid stone in the span of a heartbeat. Some were captured in aggressive poses, weapons raised, faces twisted in battle fury. Others had begun to realize something was wrong and had started to turn away, and they became stone statues caught in motion, eternal monuments to their final moment of understanding. The transformation spread through Phineus's forces like a wave, turning warriors into sculptures, silencing their war cries forever. Phineus himself saw what was happening. He watched his followers turn to stone one by one, saw Perseus standing there with something in his hands that radiated such terrible power that men became statues just from looking at it. He realized, far too late, that he had made a catastrophic mistake. He had challenged a hero who had just killed Medusa, who carried her head as a weapon, who had the favor of the gods and the power to turn his enemies to stone with a glance. Phineus tried to flee, tried to look away, but he was too slow. Or perhaps some part of him was frozen by the certainty of his doom. According to Ovid's account, Phineus fell to his knees and begged for mercy, putting his hands out in supplication, trying not to look at the terrible thing Perseus held. He pleaded that he would leave, that he would renounce his claim to Andromeda, that he would never trouble them again if only Perseus would spare his life. But Perseus, who had tried to reason with Phineus before the violence started, who had warned everyone to look away, who had given every possible chance for this to end peacefully, was not inclined to be merciful now. Too many innocent people had been endangered by Phineus's actions. The wedding celebration had been turned into a bloodbath. Andromeda had been terrified, threatened with being kidnapped or killed just after being rescued from one nightmare. Perseus forced Phineus to look at Medusa's head, and Andromeda's uncle, the man who should have protected her, but who had instead tried to steal her away, turned to stone. His final expression, captured forever in marble, was one of terror and pleading, his hands still raised in supplication, his mouth open mid-beg for mercy that would never come. He became a permanent fixture in Cepheus's palace, a reminder of what happens to those who threaten the king's family and disrupt sacred celebrations with violence. When it was over, when all of Phineus's followers were either dead or stone, Perseus carefully covered Medusa's head again and returned it to the Kibisis. The hall was silent, except for the sobbing of traumatized guests and the moaning of the wounded. What should have been a celebration had become a charnel house, with stone statues standing among the dead and injured like grotesque decorations. Blood pooled on the floor, mixing with spilled wine in a horrific parody of celebration. But Perseus and Andromeda had survived, and their marriage stood. Cetus ordered the stone statues removed from the hall, though some sources suggest that Phineus's statue was kept as a warning to others who might challenge the king's authority. The wedding celebration was eventually completed, though it must have been a subdued affair after everything that had happened. Perseus and Andromeda were married, bound together now not just by attraction and by the deal struck when she was chained to the rocks, but by the violence they had survived together, by the enemies they had faced as a united front. Their wedding night came after what had to have been one of the most traumatic days of both their lives. But through it all, they had each other. Perseus had proven that he would fight for Andromeda, that he would protect her against any threat, mortal or divine. And Andromeda had chosen him, had stood by him even when her uncle had tried to claim her, had made it clear that she wanted this marriage, wanted this man who had saved her life and who loved her enough to battle monsters and men alike for the right to call her his wife. The next morning, they began to plan their future. Perseus had won a kingdom, but his own story was not yet complete. He still had to return to Seriphos, still had to fulfill his original promise to Polydectes, and more importantly, still had to ensure his mother's safety. Andromeda understood this. She had married a hero, and heroes had obligations that couldn't be ignored. So they made plans to leave Ethiopia, to travel to Perseus's home and settle his affairs there, and then to return and claim the kingdom that Cepheus had promised. But fate, as always in Greek mythology, had other plans. Their journey home would take them through more adventures, more dangers, and ultimately to a destiny that neither of them could have predicted. The love story that had begun with a woman chained to a rock and a hero flying overhead was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. A kingdom built on love, life together. Perseus and Andromeda left Ethiopia with Cepheus's blessings and promises that the kingdom would be waiting for them when they returned. But before they could claim their future as king and queen, Perseus had unfinished business in Seriphos, that small island where he had grown up, where his mother still waited, where Polydectes was no doubt assuming that Perseus had died in his quest for Medusa's head. The journey back would take them across the sea, and Perseus still had his winged sandals, still had the magical gifts from the gods that had made his quest possible. When they arrived in Seriphos, Perseus immediately sought out his mother and Dictys, the kind fisherman who had raised him. What he found confirmed his worst fears. In his absence, Polydectes had continued his pursuit of Danae, and without Perseus there to protect her, the king had become bolder and more aggressive. Danae had been forced to take refuge in a temple with Dictys, seeking sanctuary in sacred space where even a king would think twice about dragging someone out by force. But it was a desperate situation, a temporary solution at best, and Polydectes was growing impatient. Perseus, arriving back from his impossible quest, alive and victorious, with a bride at his side and Medusa's head in his bag, went immediately to confront the king. He found Polydectes in his palace, perhaps celebrating what he thought would be his imminent wedding to Danae, perhaps simply enjoying his power and his certainty that Perseus was dead and no longer an obstacle to his desires. Imagine Polydectes' shock when Perseus walked into his hall, very much alive, with proof that he had accomplished the impossible task that was meant to kill him. According to the ancient sources, Polydectes didn't believe Perseus at first. He claimed that the head in the bag must be a fake, that Perseus was lying about killing Medusa, that this was some kind of trick to avoid punishment for failing his boastful promise. It was understandable skepticism in a way. After all, countless heroes had gone seeking Medusa, and none had returned. Why should Perseus be any different? But Perseus was different, and he had proof. Just as he had at his wedding when Phineus attacked, Perseus warned those loyal to him, those who had been kind to his mother, to close their eyes and look away. Then he removed Medusa's head from the kibisis and held it up for Polydectes and his corrupt court to see. The transformation was instant. Polydectes turned to stone, mid-sentence, probably mid-denial. His final expression, one of shock and disbelief. His courtiers, those who had supported his harassment of Danae, those who had laughed when Perseus was sent on what they thought was a suicide mission, they too became stone, frozen forever in their final moments of understanding that they had bet on the wrong outcome. With Polydectes dead, Seriphos needed a new king, and Perseus made sure that the crown went to the right person. He gave it to Dictys, the humble fisherman who had pulled a chest from the sea years ago and had found inside a woman and her baby, who had raised Perseus as his own son without asking for anything in return, who had protected Danae to the best of his ability when Perseus was away. Dictys, who had never sought power or glory, who had simply tried to live a good life and help those in need, became king of Seriphos by the decree of Zeus's son. Perseus also returned the magical items that had made his quest possible. The winged sandals went back to Hermes, the helm of darkness back to Hades. Medusa's head, that terrible weapon, he gave to Athena herself. The goddess took the severed head and placed it upon her aegis, her shield, where it would remain as both decoration and weapon, turning her enemies to stone. In this way, Medusa, whose transformation had been caused by events in Athena's temple, became eternally associated with the goddess, her image forever serving as protection and warning. With his mother safe, with Dictys secure on the throne of Seriphos, Perseus could finally turn his attention to the future he had promised Andromeda. But before they could return to Ethiopia and claim the kingdom Cepheus had offered, Perseus felt compelled to visit his birthplace, to go to Argos, and perhaps confront his grandfather Acrisius, the man whose fear of prophecy had led to Perseus being cast into the sea as an infant. But when Perseus and Andromeda arrived in Argos, they found that Acrisius was not there. The old king, hearing that Perseus was alive and returning home, had fled. He had never forgotten the prophecy that his grandson would kill him. And now that Perseus had proven himself capable of impossible things, had killed Medusa, and survived quests that should have been fatal, Acrisius was more terrified than ever. He had gone to Larissa, a city far from Argos, seeking refuge with the king there, hoping that distance would protect him from fate. Perseus chose not to pursue him. He had no particular desire to kill his grandfather, no burning need for revenge, despite everything Acrisius had done to him and his mother. Perseus had Andromeda now, had his mother safe, had proven himself as a hero. What did he need with vengeance against a fearful old man? So he stayed in Argos, and he might have claimed the throne there as his birthright, but he felt uncomfortable doing so while his grandfather still lived, even if that grandfather had tried to murder him as an infant. Instead, Perseus went to Larissa himself, not to hunt Acrisius, but to participate in funeral games that were being held there in honor of the local king's father. Athletic competitions were an important part of Greek culture, a way for men to prove themselves and honor the dead. And Perseus, as a hero and a prince, was a natural participant. He enrolled in the games, intending to compete in various events, to demonstrate his prowess in ways that didn't involve monsters or divine weapons. One of the events was the discus throw, a test of strength and skill where athletes would hurl a heavy disc as far as they could. Perseus took his turn, winding up and releasing the discus with all his considerable strength. But something went wrong. Whether it was a gust of wind, a miscalculation of force, or simply the working of fate itself, the discus flew off course. It sailed away from the designated field and into the crowd of spectators who had gathered to watch the games. The heavy disc struck someone in the crowd. That person was Acrisius, the old king hiding in Larissa, thinking he was safe from the grandson prophesied to kill him, was struck down by a stray discus thrown by that very grandson during innocent athletic games. The prophecy, which Acrisius had spent decades trying to avoid, which had led him to imprison his daughter and cast his grandson into the sea, which had driven him to flee his own kingdom, was fulfilled in the most accidental and unavoidable way possible. Perseus had killed his grandfather, not through murder or revenge, but through pure chance at a sporting event where he didn't even know Acrisius was present. The ancient sources tell us that Perseus was devastated when he realized what he had done. He had not wanted this, had not sought Acrisius's death, had specifically chosen not to pursue him. But the fates had decreed that Acrisius would die by his grandson's hand, and no amount of running, no amount of precaution could change that fundamental reality. Prophecies in Greek mythology always came true, though often in unexpected ways, and this was perhaps the most unexpected fulfillment of all. Perseus gave his grandfather a proper burial, honoring him despite everything Acrisius had done, because that was what duty demanded and what his own sense of honor required. But after this tragedy, Perseus felt unable to rule in Argos. The city was rightfully his by inheritance, but how could he take the throne of a man he had accidentally killed? Even if that man was his grandfather, and even if the killing was prophesied and unintentional, it felt wrong, cursed, stained by blood, even though no malice had been involved. So Perseus made an arrangement with his cousin Megapenthus, who ruled the nearby city of Tiryns. They would exchange kingdoms. Megapenthus would take Argos, and Perseus would take Tiryns. It was a solution that satisfied both men and relieved Perseus of the burden of ruling a city where he had inadvertently killed the previous king. He and Andromeda moved to Tiryns, and there they began to build their life together in earnest. But Perseus was not content to simply rule an existing city. He was a hero, a son of Zeus, a man who had accomplished feats thought impossible. Near Tiryns, he founded a new city, one that would become among the most important in ancient Greece. He called it Mycenae. According to tradition, the massive stone walls that surrounded Mycenae were so huge that later Greeks would believe only giants called cyclopes could have moved such blocks, giving rise to the term Cyclopean masonry for this type of construction. Mycenae would become the seat of power for the entire region, eventually overshadowing both Argos and Tiryns in importance. Its massive fortifications, its strategic position, and the dynasty that Perseus founded there would make it the center of what modern archaeologists call the Mycenaean civilization, the culture that dominated Bronze Age Greece, and that served as the historical foundation for many of the myths and legends that Homer would later immortalize in the Iliad and the Odyssey. But before Mycenae became a legendary center of power, before its fame spread throughout the ancient world, it was simply home to Perseus and Andromeda and the family they were building together. And what a family it would be. The sources tell us that Andromeda bore Perseus many children, a family large enough to ensure the dynasty would continue, varied enough that their descendants would spread throughout Greece and beyond. Their children included several sons, each of whom would found their own lines and establish their own legacies. There was Perseus, who, according to some sources, traveled east and became the ancestor of the Persian people, giving that great nation a connection to Greek heroic mythology. There was Alcaeus, whose own son would be Amphitryon, and whose grandson would be the greatest hero Greece would ever know, Heracles. Yes, through Andromeda and Perseus, the bloodline ran directly to Heracles, making the woman who had been chained to a rock as a sacrifice the great-grandmother of the man who would complete the 12 labors and ascend to godhood after his death. They had Sthenelus, who would become king after Perseus, continuing the dynasty in Mycenae. There was Electryon, who would have his own tragic story involving his daughter Alcmena, who would become the mortal mother of Heracles. And there was Mestor and Helios, each founding their own lines, each carrying forward the blood of Zeus through Perseus, and ensuring that their grandfather's divine lineage would spread throughout the ancient world. Andromeda also bore Perseus' daughters, though their names are less consistently recorded in the surviving sources. One daughter, Gorgophone, has a name that means Gorgon killer, a commemoration of Perseus's most famous feat. She would marry twice and have children of her own, and her descendants would include some of the most famous figures in Greek mythology. Through various lines and generations, Perseus and Andromeda became the ancestors of many of the heroes whose stories fill the ancient myths. But more than their children's accomplishments, more than the dynasties and kingdoms that would spring from their union, what stands out about Perseus and Andromeda is the nature of their marriage itself. In a mythology filled with tragic love stories, with unfaithful husbands and suffering wives, with relationships destroyed by jealousy or divine intervention or mortal weakness, Perseus and Andromeda appear to have been different. The sources consistently portray them as remaining together throughout their lives. And there are no stories of Perseus taking lovers or concubines, no tales of Andromeda being pursued by other men or gods once she was married. This was Andromeda's triumph as much as Perseus's. She had gone from being a victim, a sacrifice chained to a rock waiting to die for her mother's sins, to being a queen, a mother to children who would become ancestors of heroes, the co-founder of one of Greece's most powerful cities. She had not been merely rescued and then forgotten, relegated to the background of her husband's story. Instead, based on how the myths remember her, she appears to have become a partner in building something that would last for generations. Her courage on that rock, her willingness to marry Perseus, her strength in accompanying him through the dangers that followed, all led to a life that the ancient Greeks considered worthy of remembrance. The ancient sources don't give us many specific stories about their day-to-day life together. We don't have accounts of their private conversations, their small joys and challenges, the intimate details of their years as rulers of Mycenae. But this absence of dramatic conflict is itself noteworthy. In Greek mythology, relationships typically appear in the stories when something goes wrong, when infidelity occurs, when tragedy strikes. That Perseus and Andromeda's marriage is notable primarily for its apparent stability suggests they may have achieved something rare, a genuine partnership. Perseus ruled Mycenae for many years, and by the accounts that survive, he ruled well. He was remembered as a just king, a wise leader, a man who had proven his courage and who brought that same determination to governance. Andromeda was remembered alongside him, a woman of dignity who never forgot the terror she had faced or the unlikely rescue that had saved her. They grew old together, which was itself somewhat unusual for heroes and their wives in Greek mythology. Many heroes died young, killed in battle, or by divine intervention, or through tragic circumstances. But Perseus and Andromeda lived long lives, long enough to see their children grow to adulthood, to see their grandchildren born, to see the city they had founded flourish. They had time, that precious resource, to simply be together. When death finally came for them, as it comes for all mortals, they died in Mycenae, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had created together. And then, according to ancient tradition, something remarkable happened that confirmed what had been true all along, that their love story was significant enough to deserve immortality. The gods placed them in the heavens. Whether it was Zeus himself honoring his son, or Athena remembering Perseus's service, or simply the divine recognition that some stories deserve to be told forever, Perseus and Andromeda became constellations. Their forms were traced in stars, positioned so that they would remain together for all eternity, visible to anyone who looked up at the night sky and knew where to look. Legacy and immortality. Among the stars. Look up at the northern sky on a clear autumn night, and you can see them still. The constellation. Perseus, the hero forever holding the head of Medusa, stands near the constellation Andromeda, the princess with her arms outstretched, no longer chained to a rock, but free among the stars. Nearby is Cassiopeia, the vain queen whose boasting started it all, forever seated on her throne, which appears to tip upside down as the constellation rotates through the year, a celestial reminder of her punishment. Cetus is there too, the king who had to make impossible choices, and even Cetus, the sea monster, has its place in the sky as a constellation in the southern celestial hemisphere. The ancient Greeks saw the night sky as a canvas where the gods recorded the most important stories, the ones that deserved to be remembered forever. Not everyone got this honor. You had to be truly significant, truly worthy to be transformed into stars. The fact that Perseus and Andromeda both received this immortalization speaks to how powerfully their story resonated with the ancient world. But their legacy was more than just astronomical. Through their children and grandchildren, Perseus and Andromeda became ancestors of some of the most important figures in Greek mythology, and, according to the ancient Greeks' understanding of their own history, in Greek history as well. Their great-grandson Heracles, or Hercules, as the Romans would call him, would become the greatest hero Greece ever produced, famous for his 12 labors, his unmatched strength, and his eventual ascension to godhood. He could trace his lineage directly back to Perseus and Andromeda, to the son of Zeus, who had killed Medusa and the Ethiopian princess, who had survived sacrifice to a sea monster. Through various descendants, Perseus and Andromeda's bloodline connected to many of the other great heroes and royal houses of Greek legend. The kings of Mycenae would all claim descent from him. Mycenae itself would play a crucial role in the legendary Trojan War, with Agamemnon ruling from the city that Perseus had founded centuries before, according to the mythological timeline. Some ancient sources even claimed that certain royal houses, including some in Sparta, could trace their ancestry back to Perseus through various genealogical lines. Whether these connections were historically accurate or were prestigious claims made by later rulers seeking legitimacy through association with legendary heroes, the important point is that Perseus and Andromeda were considered such significant figures that connection to them was deemed valuable and noble. The story of their romance also had lasting impact on how love and heroism were understood in ancient Greek culture and beyond. Their tale established narrative patterns that would be repeated throughout mythology and literature. The hero rescuing the princess from a monster became an archetypal story that would appear in various forms across cultures. But what made Perseus and Andromeda's version distinctive was what came after the rescue, the partnership that developed between them. Andromeda's role in the myth extends beyond the rescue scene. Yes, she needed saving from a situation that would have killed her, circumstances completely beyond her control. But in the myths as they've come down to us, once rescued, she became a partner in Perseus's life. She chose to marry him, traveled with him, helped him build Mycenae, raised their children, and ruled as queen beside him. The sources remember her alongside Perseus, treating them as a pair whose story was worth telling together. The symbolism of their constellations emphasized this partnership. Perseus and Andromeda are positioned near each other in the sky, part of a cluster of related constellations that tell their story. When you learn to identify these constellations, you're essentially reading the myth written in stars. Perseus stands triumphant, still holding Medusa's head after all these centuries. Andromeda is free, her arms outstretched not in bondage, but in embrace of the eternal heavens. They are together, as they were in life, bound by a love that proved stronger than monsters, stronger than human malice, stronger even than death. Cassiopeia's constellation serves as a warning about the dangers of hubris. As the constellation rotates through the year, she appears to be sitting upright on her throne at some times and hanging upside down at others, forever reminded of the vanity that almost cost her everything. The ancient Greeks used this as a teaching tool, pointing to the stars and telling children about the queen whose pride brought disaster upon her kingdom and nearly killed her daughter. It was a celestial lesson in humility, in the importance of respecting the gods and not claiming to be better than divine beings. The constellation, Cetus, serves as a reminder of the challenges Perseus overcame, the monster he defeated for love. Even in death, even transformed into stars, the sea monster remains part of the story, a permanent testament to Perseus's courage and his devotion to Andromeda. Without Cetus, there would have been no rescue, no dramatic meeting, no love story written in the stars. The monster, horrible as it was, played a necessary role in bringing Perseus and Andromeda together. Throughout the centuries after the ancient Greek period, Perseus and Andromeda's story continued to inspire artists, writers, and storytellers. Roman poets like Ovid retold their tale with elaborate detail, adding emotional depth and dramatic flourishes that made the story even more compelling. Medieval and Renaissance artists depicted the scene of Andromeda chained to the rock, with Perseus arriving to save her, in paintings and sculptures that emphasized both the drama of the moment and the beauty of the doomed princess. The story resonated across different cultures and time periods because it touched on universal themes. The innocent suffering for the guilty person's crimes, Andromeda punished for her mother's vanity, the hero appearing at the darkest moment when all hope seems lost, Perseus arriving just as Cetus was about to claim its victim. Love at first sight, that instant connection that defies logic but feels more real than reason. The battle against impossible odds, one man against a monster sent by a god. Loyalty in the face of danger, Perseus and Andromeda standing together against Phineus and his armed followers. And finally, happiness earned through struggle, a love that was tested repeatedly but never broken. In psychological terms, the story of Perseus and Andromeda can be read as a narrative about transformation and growth. Perseus begins as an unwanted child, cast into the sea by his grandfather, surviving only through luck and divine intervention. He grows up in obscurity, the adopted son of a fisherman, with no idea of his true heritage. Then he is forced into an impossible quest by a king who wants him dead. But through this quest, through facing and overcoming challenges that would have killed any ordinary person, Perseus discovers who he truly is. He claims his divine heritage, proves his heroic nature, and becomes worthy of the happiness he will eventually find. Andromeda's transformation is equally significant. She begins as a victim twice over, first of her mother's vanity, and then of divine punishment for a crime she didn't commit. She faces death with courage, but has no power to save herself. Then Perseus appears, and her story shifts. She goes from victim to survivor, from sacrificial offering to bride of a hero, from a woman whose life was controlled by others to a queen who helps rule a kingdom. Her transformation is from powerlessness to power, from being an object in others' stories to being a subject in her own. Together, they transform each other. Perseus, who was driven by duty and by the need to prove himself, learns about love and partnership. Andromeda, who had been taught by her mother's example that beauty was the most important quality, learns about courage and loyalty and the strength that comes from standing beside someone who values you for more than just your appearance. They both become more than they were individually, and their children inherit not just their blood, but the qualities they developed through their trials. The dynasty they founded in Mycenae lasted for generations, and through that dynasty, their influence shaped Greek history and mythology in ways that are difficult to fully measure. Every time Heracles performed one of his legendary labors, he was carrying forward the heroic tradition established by his great-grandfather, Perseus. Every time the kings of Mycenae made decisions that affected the wider Greek world, they were acting as descendants of the man who had killed Medusa and the woman who had survived sacrifice to a sea monster. In artistic depictions throughout history, certain moments from Perseus and Andromeda's story appear again and again. The most common is the moment of rescue, with Andromeda chained to the rock, naked and vulnerable, while Perseus swoops down from the sky or emerges from battle with Cetus to free her. Artists were drawn to this scene for its dramatic intensity, for the contrast between the helpless princess and the dynamic hero, for the implicit promise of the love story that would follow. But other moments also captured artists' imaginations. The wedding feast, interrupted by Phineus's attack, appeared in numerous paintings and sculptures. The chaos of battle contrasted with what should have been a celebration. Perseus holding Medusa's head, turning his enemies to stone, became an iconic image of divine justice and heroic power. And the quieter scenes, Perseus and Andromeda together after the battles were won, showed the romantic ideal of a love worth fighting for. In literature, the story inspired countless variations and adaptations. Some authors emphasized the romantic elements, dwelling on the love at first sight and the devotion that followed. Others focused on the action, on Perseus's battles against Cetus and Phineus, using the story as an example of heroic courage. Still others used it as a moral tale, with Cassiopeia's punishment serving as a warning about pride, and Andromeda's suffering illustrating the innocent victims of others' sins. Modern psychology has found interesting parallels in the Perseus and Andromeda myth. The damsel in distress archetype, while often criticized today for its implications about women's passivity, can be read differently when we look at the complete story rather than just the rescue scene. Andromeda's situation was created by her mother's actions and divine caprice, factors completely beyond her control, much like how people today find themselves in difficult situations, not of their own making. Perseus's appearance represents not just masculine heroism, but the hope that help can come from unexpected sources when we need it most. And their subsequent partnership represents the idea that people who help each other in times of crisis can build lasting, meaningful relationships. The astronomical immortalization of Perseus and Andromeda also had practical significance in ancient times. Sailors used these constellations for navigation, finding their way across dark seas by the stars that represented lovers who had endured storms and monsters to be together. There's something poetic about that, about people in danger on the ocean, looking up at the stars and seeing the story of Perseus and Andromeda, drawing strength from the knowledge that love and courage could overcome even the wrath of Poseidon himself. In ancient Greek education, the story of Perseus and Andromeda would have been one of the myths that children learned early, teaching them about courage, about the consequences of pride, about love and loyalty. Parents would point to the sky and tell their children about the hero and the princess, about how bravery could overcome any obstacle, about how true love was worth fighting for, about how happiness had to be earned, but was all the more precious for being hard-won. The different elements of the story served different pedagogical purposes. Cassiopeia's fate taught humility and respect for the gods. Andromeda's courage in facing death taught dignified acceptance of circumstances beyond one's control. Perseus's quest taught that seemingly impossible tasks could be accomplished with divine help, clever thinking, and determination. Their marriage taught that love between equals, based on mutual respect and shared hardship, could endure and flourish. In the ancient Greek understanding, becoming a constellation was the ultimate form of immortality. Yes, they believed in an afterlife, in Hades, where souls went after death. But the afterlife was often depicted as a shadowy, diminished existence, where the dead were pale reflections of their living selves. To be placed in the stars, however, was to achieve something greater. It was to be remembered forever, to have your story told as long as humans looked up at the night sky, to be literally elevated above the mortal realm into something eternal and unchanging. Perseus and Andromeda earned this immortality not through their suffering, though they had both suffered greatly, and not through divine parentage alone, though Perseus was Zeus's son. They earned it through their love, through the choices they made to stand by each other, through the life they built together. They earned it by being in a mythology full of tragic and dysfunctional relationships, a genuinely happy couple who loved each other from their dramatic first meeting until their deaths in old age. Their story tells us that love doesn't have to end in tragedy to be worth remembering. It tells us that heroism isn't just about slaying monsters, but also about protecting those we love and building something lasting with them. It tells us that even people who start their relationships in the most dramatic and unlikely circumstances can find happiness and normalcy together. And it tells us that such happiness, such love, such partnership is worthy of being written in the stars themselves, preserved forever, for all the world to see. When you look up at the constellation Andromeda tonight, you're seeing more than just stars randomly scattered across the sky. You're seeing a princess who faced death with courage, who was rescued by a hero who fell in love with her at first sight, who chose to marry that hero and travel with him into danger, who stood by him through violence and tragedy, who helped him build a kingdom and raise a family, who lived to old age with him, and who was deemed worthy by the gods themselves to be immortalized in the heavens. When you look at Perseus, you're seeing a hero who was thrown away as a baby, who survived against all odds, who accomplished impossible quests, who fought monsters, both supernatural and human, but whose greatest achievement wasn't killing Medusa or founding Mycenae. His greatest achievement was finding Andromeda, winning her love, and keeping that love alive through all the years they spent together. Their stars will still be there tomorrow night, and the night after, and centuries from now when we are all long gone. Perseus and Andromeda will still be together in the sky, still telling their story to anyone who takes the time to look up and remember. They are proof that love can be both dramatic and lasting, that happiness can follow tragedy, that two people who truly commit to each other can build something that outlasts even their own lives. In a mythology filled with warnings and tragedies, with gods who destroy mortals on whims and heroes who die young in pointless wars. The story of Perseus and Andromeda stands out as something different. It's a story with a genuinely happy ending, a love that conquered monsters and endured through time, a partnership that founded dynasties and earned immortality. They met in the worst possible circumstances. She was chained to a rock, waiting to be devoured. He was carrying the severed head of a monster, returning from a quest that was meant to kill him. But from that impossible beginning, they built something beautiful. They fought for each other, stood by each other, loved each other, and raised a family that would change the course of Greek mythology and history. And when their mortal lives ended, the gods looked at what they had created together and decided it was worthy of the highest honor they could bestow. They placed Perseus and Andromeda in the heavens, where their love story would be told in stars for as long as humans existed, to look up at the night sky and wonder about the patterns they saw there. That is the ultimate legacy of Perseus and Andromeda. Not just the kingdoms they founded, or the heroes they gave birth to, though those were significant. Their real legacy is the proof that love can triumph, that happiness is possible even after the darkest times, that two people who choose each other and commit to building a life together can create something worth remembering forever. So tonight, if the sky is clear, look up and find them, Perseus and Andromeda, the hero and the princess, together among the stars where they belong. Remember their story, how it began with chains and monsters, how it continued through battles and kingdoms, and how it ended with two people who had lived long, full lives together, being placed in the heavens as a testament to the power of love. Remember that some stories have happy endings, that some loves do last forever, and that sometimes, when we dare greatly for the people we love, we create something worthy of immortality. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the stars and through one of mythology's most beautiful love stories. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the legend of Perseus and Andromeda, please like this video and subscribe to Myths of the Night for more tales from Greek mythology. Until next time, may your own love story be worthy of the stars.